South Africa in 2 Acts is the culmination of our cultural exchange with South African pen that has been supported by the Ford Foundation and the Jerome L. Green Foundation. Over the past 18 months, we have collaborated on key free expression battles in South Africa and participated in the Open Book Festival in Cape Town. On a personal note, I'm especially thrilled to have the country's premier writers come to New York. After law school, I traveled to South Africa on a Rotary Ambassadorial Scholarship, which is an honor I actually share with Roger Ebert, the late film critic. And the Rainbow Nation is where I was trained as a fiction writer. Books will be available for sale at the table outside, where the authors will be available to sign copies after the event. Before I introduce each of our guests, please silence all things in your possession which beep, ring, buzz, play musical tunes, or bark. The format of South Africa in 2 Acts will feature an opening short lecture by Siphiwe Mahala and a panel discussion led by Peter Godwin. Peter Godwin is the president of PEN American Center and was a 2010 Guggenheim Fellow. He is an award-winning foreign correspondent, author, documentary filmmaker, and screenwriter. Born and raised in Africa, Godwin studied law at Cambridge University and international relations at Oxford University. He argued one of the first human rights cases under the regime of Robert Mugabe before becoming a foreign correspondent for the London Sunday Times and the BBC in over 60 countries. Godwin is the author of 6 nonfiction books, including Mukiwa, which received the George Orwell Prize and the Esquire Apple Waterstones Award, and The Fear, Robert Mugabe and the Martyrdom of Zimbabwe. Siphiwe Mahala was born in Grahamstown, Eastern Cape, province of South Africa. His short stories appear in numerous literary journals and magazines locally and internationally. He is the recipient of the 2006 Ernst van Heerden Creative Writing Award for his debut novel, When a Man Cries. Mahala translated his debut novel into his native Xhosa language as Yakal Indonda, which I think he can correct that pronunciation. His short story collection, African Delights, was selected by Africa Book Club as one of the best books of 2011. He is the head of books and publishing in the Department of Arts and Culture for the Republic of South Africa. Welcome, Siphiwe.
Thank you, David. I have no idea why he chose that I speak first. I've been in the US for a week, and I'm told that before we came here it was pretty cold, so we came with the South African sun. But I think a lot more followed me. Last night, when I got to my hotel from a friend's place, I entered with 6 other occupants. And the security guards decided to call me aside and ask me for my pass. And coming from South Africa, anything along those lines is reminiscent of our past. A past that I live half of my life in. In other words, I'm part of a generation that grew up in apartheid South Africa, and I've lived the largest part of my life in post-apartheid South Africa. So for someone with that kind of past, it is easy to attribute everything to racism. And it was only later on when I was in my room that I thought about it. And say, yes, I was the only black person among 6 others. But at the same time, at midnight, there was a young man wearing a baseball hat with a backpack. And this happens not too long after the Boston Marathon. So while the temptation is there to link it to racism, but there are certain facts that we have to take into consideration. And I think when you talk about the legacy of apartheid or racism in South Africa, we tend to assume that there will be an immediate rupture from our past. And our daily lives in South Africa are not exactly like that. If I can share another quick anecdote, I'm from the Eastern Cape, as Deji had indicated. And I went to Joburg in 2002 as a student. And I've been in Joburg now. Well, I live in Pretoria, but Joburg and Pretoria is more or less the same thing. I've been there now for 11 years. And, I went to Joburg knowing that it's a crime-ridden city. But to my disappointment, I've only been robbed just once. And I was robbed by a white man. So, when the case of Oscar Pistorius, for instance, the great athlete who's an inspiration to many South Africans and many people all over the world, came to the fore, there were so many conflicting ideas. On the one hand, we have one white guy, Afrikaner, who killed another white person. And on the other, there is the talk of crime in South Africa. And one of the arguments that were made is that Pistorius had to sleep with a gun under his pillow because of the crime situation in South Africa. For the record, I don't have a gun and I don't intend owning one. So in a nutshell, this is the past that keeps haunting us, and even when things are totally irrelevant, we tend to associate them with the popular view of the country. And now, talking about literature in South Africa. Obviously, with the ushering in of the democratic order, the popular question, which got annoying sometimes, was what would South African writers write about now that the grand theme of apartheid is gone? And we're coming from the past where writers were persecuted, banned, and many of them exiled, especially here in the United States. So now we supposedly had a free country where writers had to explore a variety of themes. And as from '94, actually from the very first, from the inaugural speech of President Mandela, he was ushered in by a poet. And in his speech, he quoted, I think, Ingrid Jonker, a late South African poet. And poetry was part of the politics of South Africa. One of the most quoted speeches by a South African politician, for instance, is I'm an African, by the then Deputy President, Thabo Mbeki. However, it would be vulgarization of poetry if we reduce it to praise singing. We believe that writers and poets in general have a bigger role to play in society. And one of the major controversial moments in our early democracy was the publication of Disgrace by James Mda. The book, some of us felt that it seems to push the white compatriots away to say, now that we have a black-dominated government, then there is no place for white people in this country. And to make matters worse, James Mda himself expatriated after that. He now lives in Australia. But that created a debate. It is a novel that was discussed in Parliament. The ANC, which is the ruling party in South Africa, submitted a complaint with the Human Rights Commission. And I want us to note that the ANC was not happy about the novel, and it went to be discussed in Parliament. But it was a debate. Disgrace is still circulated all over South Africa, but it was not censored. So now, this takes me further to the worrying trends that we've seen recently. One of the major contributors, satirists in South Africa is Jonathan Shapiro, otherwise known as Zapiro. He contributes to Sunday Times, which is the widest distributed weekly, Mail and Guardian, another major weekly, and The Times, which is a daily. Zapiro lampoons politicians all the time, and the current president actually is one of his favorite subjects. And the president has sued Zapiro several times, and most of the time withdrawing those charges. And also, there's a young artist, Brett Murray, who decided to paint, who produced a painting that's called The Spear. It was also lampooning the president. And two people, actually one white person, went to that gallery and with a can of paint and defaced that painting. And there was a young black guy who decided to join him in defacing the painting. And we had a security guard who decided whose duty was to prevent that from happening. What he did, he went to the black guy, threw him on the floor, headbutted him and threw him on the floor and handcuffed him. And then went to talk to the white guy who had actually brought the paint. So that, again, has a lot to do with our past. Hence, I'm saying there can be no immediate rupture from the past. But again, the interesting thing is that as that happened, that young man drove all the way from Limpopo over 3 hours to go to Goodman Gallery to deface that paint. Now, at the same time, in Limpopo, his home province, there were thousands of kids who did not get textbooks by the middle of the year. And I think that raises a question about us as the nation in terms of our priorities. But the interesting thing is that at the same time, the labor movement, which is part of the tripartite alliance, in other words, an alliance with the ruling party, threatened to stage a march, a men-only march against the painting. And the unique thing about that march, especially that it was going to be men only, is that they were going to march naked, pledging solidarity with the president, whose genitals were on public display. And again, that raises questions. When there is, on the one hand, a situation of young people who cannot access education, and at the same time, a labor movement would be preoccupied with one man's genitals. So these are some of the dynamics of the South Africa that we live in. And as writers, Deji indicated that, for instance, I'm the head of books and publishing in the National Department of Arts and Culture. In simple terms, I'm a civil servant. I work for government. And so one would wonder, how does one express or challenge or even criticize government when I'm essentially part of the problem? And I think this is what part of the democracy that we enjoy in South Africa, that our constitution guarantees free speech, freedom of expression. But at the same time, unfortunately, I am exploiting that. That's why I'm free to write. I don't have to take my work to any censorship board. And as a citizen of South Africa, I'm still in a position to critique the society. So, but now, with the emergence of the Protection of Information Bill, which was adopted by Cabinet last week, there are worrying trends that actually threaten freedom of speech in South Africa. At the moment, yes, the bill has been discussed, has been in the public discourse for the past 3 years, and certain amendments have been made, including to ensure that the whistleblowers, in other words, those who reveal information that relates to corruption, won't be persecuted on the basis of that. So that is good progress. But at the same time, we remain suspicious, especially that at the early stages of the information bill, when we started talking about it, an investigative journalist from the Sunday Times, Mzilikazi Africa, was arrested, and there was heavily armed police arresting one man, and it remained unclear what the charges were against him. But later on, the Commissioner of Police, who is now a former Bheki Cele, went back to apologize, to say, "I'm sorry, I was misled." But in a case where a Commissioner of Police won't come back and say, "I was misled," in a case where the Protection of Information Bill is used to persecute journalists, writers who may be challenging some of the decisions and actions taken by politicians and civil servants, we do not yet have a clear view of what is happening. So that is part of the worrying trend. So all in all, while we're enjoying our democracy, we must bear in mind that freedom of expression is a human rights issue, and it is a right that we must guard with all our might. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I just have to reclaim my microphone. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm Peter Godwin, and I just would like, before we... I can do this, hold on. Can you hear me? Does that still work? Before we open up this discussion up to the rest of our panel, I would indeed like to introduce them. On my immediate right is Margie Orford, an award-winning journalist and internationally acclaimed writer, and the author of the Claire Hart series, as well as several children's books and works of non-fiction. Her novels have been translated into 9 languages. She was born in London and grew up in Namibia. A Fulbright scholar, she was educated in South Africa and the United States, and she's executive vice president of South African Pen and the patron of the children's book charity, the Little Hands Trust, and Margie lives in Cape Town. And on her right is Zakes Mda, who's a South African writer, a painter, a composer, and filmmaker. He commutes between South Africa and the US, as he was explaining to me earlier, a long-distance migrant worker, he described himself, working as a professor of creative writing at Ohio University, a beekeeper in the Eastern Cape, a dramaturge at the Market Theatre in Johannesburg, and a director of the Southern African Multimedia AIDS Trust in Sophiatown, Johannesburg. His novel, Ways of Dying, won the Mnet Book Prize, and his 2001 novel, The Heart of Redness, won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize for Africa, the Hurston Wright Legacy Award, and the Sunday Times Fiction Prize. After that scene setter by Siphiwe, I wanted to just open it up. just briefly, I've covered the last 5 years of apartheid as a correspondent. And in those days, certainly as a journalist, but as has already been referred to, as a writer, there really was only one subject in South Africa, and that was the subject of race. Apartheid was such a big, extraordinary moral issue that to write about anything else seemed kind of irrelevant, and everything you wrote about was an aspect of that kind of huge, huge story. And so my first question to the panel really is, how important is race still, nearly 20 years after the end of apartheid? And people often refer to apartheid as leaving a scar in South Africa, and I often think that that's a little premature, that perhaps what it still leaves is a wound. A scar implies that it's healed. But how important is it still after nearly 20 years?
I mean, it's something that has been present in all our lives from the beginning. And, you know, I mean, you just grow up in a system which you slowly realize was not a normal way to be. And I must say, before I talk about how much has changed and how little it's changed as a writer, I must say it was through literature that as a white African really, I got to see and to read and to understand the way that my fellow citizens lived and experienced the country that I was growing up in. But you know, one of the things I've tried to do in the books and the novels that I've written is to get under the skin of South Africa, as it were, because many responses, many reactions, I think Sipiwe was talking about this, are complexly refracted through race. So I went the way of writing crime fiction, not because it was a genre. There was no crime fiction sort of prior to 94, 95, where the first novels started coming out, because apartheid was such a massive story. But I worked as a journalist, and I realized that the only people who traversed the whole society from a shebeen through to the president's cocktail parties were journalists and cops. So it became a way of writing, and they're always outsiders, they're always strangers. It was a way of investigating the very society that I lived in. And I realized, as I've looked at crime very closely over the last 12 years, Sipiwe was bringing it up. He lives in near Johannesburg. I live in Cape Town, where we hardly have any crime compared to in the north of the country. But it was an experience that both seemed to be entirely determined by race, but the more I've worked with it, it's really not. It's often just a trauma that lives beneath the skin, as it were. So you can't get away from it, but I think the ways that people are writing about it is increasingly complex.
Yes. Well, I also think that the past will always be a strong presence in the present. So, I mean, you know, we're still dealing with that legacy of apartheid even to this day. But then, even in the past, actually, people did write about different things. You know, people wrote about many different subjects, you know, even during the days of apartheid. It's just that apartheid was, you know, the dominant discourse in society. And it was a dominant discourse for a reason. You know, it touched every aspect of the people's lives. It determined where they should work and where they could not work, who they could love and who they would not love. They were not allowed to love. What job they were allowed to do, where they could live and where they were not allowed to live. So depending on race. So that meant that every story you wrote would have to do with apartheid, you know. Why? Because apartheid touched every aspect of your life. if you wrote a love story, it would have to do with apartheid, because apartheid touched on those issues, of your personal life. So, although then it would seem that we were writing about apartheid, we were writing about many different things, but all of them, were affected by apartheid one way or another, and therefore apartheid would feature in those stories. The difference now, of course, is that there are other issues. You see, we no longer have that predominant overall thing that is looming and is touching every aspect of the people's life. But that legacy continues. We still have a lot of polarization in some aspects. We sometimes made worse by the new hubris that you find, with the new ruling elites, the arrogance of power and so on, some of which would take a racial complexion, you see. So that will be with us for quite some time, and it will therefore feature in some of the things that some of us write.
Yeah, I think race is very much part of our lives. In this book, African Delights, which is a short story collection, I've divided into four parts. The first part set in the 60s, and then 80s, 90s, and the present era. And part of the reason why I'm doing that is that it is difficult to tell the South African story without any reference to the past. Now, how we explore race. I believe race, among other things, race is an economic issue, it's a social issue, it's a consciousness issue. I have a chapter that I entitled White Encounters, for instance, where I try to reflect on the first time that I actually became aware that this is not just a doctor, but a white doctor. This is not just another child that I'm playing with, but a white child. Because there are scenes, for instance, where this young boy, from the dentist, he's taken by his mom to work, and at work he plays with the employer's son. They are the same age, and that boy happens to have been breastfed by his mother. So that bond, they sort of crossed that racial divide. But as soon as they are separated, then that is where he is conscious of race. But he's conscious of race, and also socially he's on the other side of the city. But at the same time, economically, especially if you're talking literature, for instance, we have a situation in South Africa, for instance, we have 11 official languages, but English remains dominant, especially in the publishing industry. And the interesting thing is that the dominant publishers would be your multinationals, that have no interest in promoting the languages themselves. And who are the speakers of those languages? It's the native people. So, but now, who determines what gets published? It becomes an economic issue, which is linked to the question of race and linked to our past.
I just want to say something about the literature and the writing, and apartheid and the end of apartheid was a little bit like when a bomb goes off. It flattens out all other responses or pushes the experience of normal life into frozen corners, as it were. And it seemed to me, you mentioned Kutsia's book, Disgrace. There was a lot of literature, it seemed, in the 90s that was still written in the aftermath of apartheid, as though people didn't know how else to write other than that big story. And then there was a kind of a lull But it seemed to me in the last 10 years, looking at the books that have come out, say, from the early 2000s to now, it's as though writers, especially younger writers, are writing into those parts of life that was not so dominated by this one big fault line which kind of defined everybody. It's like Russian writers, you know, the Soviet Union, totalitarianism flattened out everything. It took a long time before the shoots of smaller experiences or smaller ways of living in the country to come out. And one of the most interesting influences is South Africa is a little bit like the United States. It draws kind of immigrants and people from all over. It's filled now with Nigerian writers, writers from Kenya, from other parts in Africa, who are writing about South Africa and living there in ways that's often surprisingly different to how South Africans write about the same place. And it seems to me the start of a very new and kind of fertile literary genesis, this kind of intra-African experience of South Africa, because, I don't know, I mean, there are a number of writers, the way they perceive it is different perhaps to South Africans who are more shaped or damaged perhaps by the past that we've had.
I mean, that brings up a question which has troubled me as a writer to some extent, and I think why, which is the ownership of stories, as it were. I have always been avoided that particular controversy by writing in the first person as an announced observer, if you like what I mean, saying this is what I see and that's all. But I know there's a controversy, especially when I was in Australia. I noticed that that writers are not encouraged in fiction to write in the characters of other people, especially in particular of Aboriginal people. And in South Africa, for example, I sometimes imagine this scene where, you know, the first Dutch ships arrive and they meet some Khoisan people on the Cape and say, this is how it's going to go down. There's going to be several hundred years of institutional racism. We'll take the land. We'll do this and that. And then at the end, we'll send you our white liberal writers who will write stories about what it's like to have grown up under apartheid. We'll have Cry the Beloved Country and whatever. And that now there's a sort of, that it's about reclaiming a story, that stories are owned, that they are sort of cultural, that there is an element of cultural ownership. Do you think that exists in South Africa? Do you think those voices now are heard?
Well, I think that even, well, you know, with the example that you made, Cry the Beloved Country and other novels about black South Africans, but written by white liberals. During that period, we did have, you know, black writers who wrote about themselves. We had the Peter Abrams, who wrote in English. We had Saul Plaatje, even earlier, who also wrote in English. But then we also had many writers who wrote in the indigenous languages, you know, novels in Xhosa, in Sotho, and so on, who were very actively, you know, telling their story, you know. But of course, the literature that the outside world got to know about was that literature that was created, you know, by the dominant sectors of the society, namely the white writers, the Ellen Pattons, and so on. Black writers never really lost their voice. Their voice has always been there. They've always been writing, you know. It's just that no one was hearing it, you know, outside the circle of readers within the country and within those communities.
There's another, I think what you're asking about, who can write for who can speak, you know, whose voice or whose body can you imagine yourself into, is an ethical question of narrative that is important in South Africa, it's important in the United States, it's important everywhere where you've got a history of trauma and of domination. And I think that the narrative, there are two requirements which I don't think can ever be reconciled. The one, I think, is that it should be compulsory for human beings to imagine the stories of others, because it puts you into their position. It makes you imagine how they feel, what they suffer, what your behavior is in relation to them. That said, the thing that one must avoid is claiming that experience either as your own or becoming the authority for that person. I mean, it's a question that comes up over and over again, is can men write women characters? Now, Madame Bovary should answer that question for anybody, but it remains a complex ethical question, I think, especially in South Africa, where positions of, where things have not been resolved, where things have, the process of reconciliation, how we hear each other, how we speak to each other is formative. But I think that there are ways in which one can do it, and my own choice in sort of narrative thing was to use an investigative model as you would a journalist or a psychologist, in which you ask people the questions about their experience and then use that. And it bothered me so much that I asked a professor of ethics at the University of Cape Town about what to do, because my work is based mainly on research and interviews with people. And he said there are two criteria. The one is that one's account must be truthful, which is so difficult for a novelist. And the other one is that it must cause no further harm. And I think those questions, for me, I keep them alive with me in my writing, and I don't think you can ever answer either of them finally. But South Africa does make you think in terms of ethical narrative all the time, position and claiming.
Yeah, I think, first of all, I try consciously to not to speak of black writers as a homogeneous group. We have writers who explore a variety of themes in South Africa. And at some point, you didn't even tell, if you don't know the author or their background, you didn't even tell whether it's a black or a white writer. And which is part of the reason why I have a problem with the label black writing. In a country where the majority of people are black anyway, I don't understand why a certain component has to be labeled that way. In fact, if they were to be writing, it would be writing by the majority, and anything else outside the majority might need to be qualified that way. But in any case, in terms of the literary output there, you have works, for instance, by Lauren Bieke's Zoo City. Zoo City is one of the best-selling novels, and her protagonist is black, and she is of African origin. You know, you have Zakes Mda, who wrote The Madams, where she sort of flips the coin and tells a story of a black woman who couldn't take herself to bossing around another black sister, so she decides to get a white maid. You know, there is Funny Fori's Lobola, where an Afrikaner guy falls for a Pedi woman, and he is subjected to Pedi culture to negotiate Lobola and all such things. So there's that, you know, cross-reference. And Funny Fori's Lobola actually has become a motion picture recently. It's doing very well in the market. So we have such diversity of themes, and even though I don't think there is what I can call a wave that goes that direction, but because our literature is so diverse, you find such elements here and there.
Zakes referred earlier to what gets exported and what doesn't. In other words, the fact that there are books published in South Africa that South Africans may read but may not be read in great numbers overseas, and the way that South Africa is perceived in countries like America, for example, there is through a sort of distorting lens. I mean, for example, you brought up earlier Oscar Pistorius, which was an absolutely enormous story here. I honestly think there were probably more column inches generated on that single story than all the rest of the coverage on South Africa for the previous 10 years. And it brings me to the next subject, which for Americans looking at South Africa, and for many foreigners, and indeed for whites in South Africa, they look at the figure of Nelson Mandela as this colossus, as this secular saint, as someone who, as he now comes towards the end of his life, is it's seen. I mean, I'm already being asked about, to prepare pieces and whatever. There's a kind of huge interest in this, and I wonder if you think that the passing of Nelson Mandela will have any effect on the political situation in South Africa, or not.
No.
I think it's absurd, really.
You'll still get paid for writing your piece.
No,
though,
I
Peter.
don't. It's not. But I mean, in all seriousness,
Yeah.
this is the way that it's seen. If you talk to people outside who don't know that much about South Africa, well, this is what they will immediately ask you.
Yeah. I remember way back in 1999 when the retirement of President Mandela was imminent, and many white friends would come to me and ask, "Is it true that you're gonna chase every white man back to the sea?" That's not gonna happen. I mean, Thabo Mbeki came in and became president. That did not happen. After Thabo Mbeki, we now have Jacob Zuma, and it's not happening. It's not gonna happen. So similarly, I mean, the passing of one man cannot change the political situation. Yes, it will affect many of us. I mean, Mandela is respected by the whole world, but in terms of changing the political situation in South Africa, I do not think so. Mandela is part of a collective. He was there as a leader of the ANC. The ANC is an organization with its principles and everything. And the government, we are a constitutional democracy. He is not part of government. So that's why I think really it is absurd. Yes, we are all anxious. It would be a great loss. Already, like, he does not do much now at the present moment.
Anything, actually, not just much.
But I mean,
He's retired. He's staying there.
I think people, to be fair, people think symbolically, not that he's somehow pulling the strings or anything.
but I think even symbolic. I mean, South Africa is a robust, quarrelsome family. It's slightly dysfunctional. It's like but it's such a strong democracy. And one of the things that I think people forget is that the transition to democracy didn't happen it wasn't a magical kingdom that it was formed. It was a very long, orchestrated, organized struggle based on ANC in exile, labor movement, women's movement, writers, journalists. And one of the key elements of South Africa is this incredibly robust ability to absorb knocks, but to debate and to negotiate. And South Africans will fight, but usually at the last minute they'll make a deal and then have a barbecue, So you've got this element in politics which is so incredibly encouraging. And what, Sipiwa was talking on the legislation that might be coming up about the secrecy bill, censorship, that is actively contested. And we all love Mandela, but he's like a really, really, really old man. And symbolically, when he does finally die, everyone will be heartbroken, I'm sure, but the democracy is itself. That is the legacy and the gift that he and others with him gave us. So I'm sure nothing will be wailing and gnashing of teeth, and journalists in New York and London will get paid fat fees for writing the, So inside you live in a place that negotiates and talks, and through literature, through politics, through civic action, all sorts of things. But it's a highly functioning society with very, very deeply troubled chasms into which we fall sometimes, for sure.
Besides, we were very nice people.
Yeah, unless we're trying to kill you, we're the nicest people you're going to meet.
We send troops to Kar for peacekeeping. And then when they were shooting, our soldiers were like, no, we can't shoot kids. And they were shot by the child soldiers, 13 of our troops died. They did not go there prepared for a fight, I think. That's who you are.
Right.
I think sometimes, this magic castle of South Africa is really a trouble for writers in how we write and how South African writing is perceived abroad. As somehow we've moved on. As a democracy, we're 18 or 19. We're about to kind of leave home and kind of move into the adult world. But I often think that the way the rest of the world looks at South Africa, they can't make up another plot line. Do you know what I mean? It's like having an endless repeat of a soap opera. And we do embarrassing things like invade other countries and, like Olympic stars shoot their girlfriends and, we play to type quite often. But the narrative and the stories are so much more complex. And that really is coming out, I think, in literature, in films, and especially in younger people who apartheid, you ask a 16-year-old and they'll say, apartheid, the Second World War, and Joan of Arc is something that happened, even though in their everyday lives they live the symptoms of it.
But speaking of dysfunction, I think South Africa toggles with Brazil to have the highest Gini index in the world, the measurement of socioeconomic disparity. So in that sense, that's more than, that's not functional insofar as there's a big section of South African society who really aren't at the table, as it were. What as writers, what does one do? How does one approach that? These are people who you were talking about. What people can afford. They can't afford books. There are failing literacy rates. That seems to me that is an enormous challenge that still sits there.
Yeah, well, for us as writers, we can barely fight anyone. So what we do, we tell the stories. I remember my first novel, When a Man Cries, which is set in my hometown, where at the time there still is, bucket system for toilets. I cannot describe it, but think of pit latrines. And reading that in Joburg, and this guy, Professor Khosile, was there. This guy says, but this story is so archaic. But it is happening that was back in 2007. It is 2013, but if you go to my hometown, you'd find places where there's no running water, where people still use buckets for toilet, So that is the dynamism of our society. So as writers, we try to project that. We try to raise that to the awareness of the society, the broader society. And I'm not sure. Beyond that, for instance, my uncle here was in South Africa a couple of weeks ago, last week actually, where he was part of a movement that deals with very bad situation in schools in the province. Maybe you can speak more about that.
Amen. Well, yes. What he's talking about is some problems in some provinces, especially in the Eastern Cape, where there is no infrastructure, there are no classrooms and sanitation and so on. And all these problems, of course, especially in that province, have impacted the education of the kids very much. As you heard, I spend most of the year in Ohio, where I teach creative writing. I was invited to South Africa by young people, university students, and high school students who have formed themselves into an organization called Equal Education. And their role is to pressure the government, to force the government, actually, by various means, to provide equal education for every South African. And so I was part of a group that was invited to tour the various schools to see for ourselves the bad conditions, some of which are even worse than what used to be in that province, because I went to school in that province 50 years ago when I was at primary school, during apartheid, during Bantu education and so on. So what we found there was that the problems have nothing to do, for instance, with lack of resources, because there is money in South Africa, but it was mostly what the people there call lack of capacity, which in other words, I see mostly as, incompetence, which also has its roots, of course, in some of the history of the place. And also lack of accountability, in that the central government has given that province, billions of dollars to build classrooms and so on. And a lot of that money, after a year or two, was returned to the treasury because it was not used, you see. Whereas there are dire conditions there. But what impressed me, of course, with the whole exercise was that the young people themselves have taken it upon themselves to change that situation. They take the government to court, they pressure the government. After our tour, they summoned the officials there and the ministers in the province to come and answer and explain to us why the situation was like that. And they came, and they had to answer this question. So it is things like that make some of us continue to be very optimistic about South Africa and the future there. See, when young people take it upon themselves to do these things and to make government accountable, you see, and by various means. So that was generally what that's what he's talking about. This equal education thing.
Thank you. Before I open it up to questions, which I will do in a couple of minutes, so think of anything you'd like to ask. I just wanted to ask one last question, which is since this is a PEN event, has been a PEN issue, which we've referred to a number of times, which is, I wonder, I'd just like to know, and I'm sure some of the audience would like to know too, just where we are with this amended secrecy bill. Is it something that should worry us as writers? South Africa, as you've mentioned, it may be messy, it may be vocal, but it's this wonderfully energetic and dynamic democracy. And it does depend on a very, very lively press and media. And is it something we should still be worried about if indeed it does get signed in its current form? What does it actually say? What is its implication?
Just to give a little, for those of you not familiar, a bill was tabled some years ago and it's been known as the secrecy bill, in quote marks. It's the Protection of State Information Bill. It started off as a perfectly reasonable act which covered military installations and stuff. It was then sent back for some reason and redrafted and came tabled back in Parliament as this Protection of Information Bill. It carries 25 years for writers or journalists to publish classified information. Very broad, the information that could be classified was extremely broad, so socioeconomic things right the way through to anything that a state official would wish to classify, which of course would cover all sorts of corrupt activities and various things. Now, PEN, South African PEN and PEN International, along with a number of freedom of expression organizations and grassroots educations, one of whom is Equal Education, have fought this bill tooth and nail. There's a Right to Know campaign. Those of you who are interested, it's just right and then the numeral 2 and then NOKNOW. Very interesting grassroots campaign against this bill. It was redrafted and sent back, and it's a case study of kind of the tussle between civil society and a small section of government which wanted to push this bill through and a number of other restrictions on the media. It was finally passed. I think there still isn't a public interest defense clause in the bill. It's got all sorts of problems. It was watered down a bit. It was passed by the two houses of Parliament and by Cabinet. So as it stands now, it will be sent to the President. If he signs it into law, it will become an act. The status then for PEN and for other freedom of expression organizations is that it's directly against the Constitution. The South African Constitution guarantees socioeconomic rights, as Zakes was mentioning, why Equal Education can sue the government for a bad school. It also states absolutely clearly that the right to freedom of expression is it's one of the primary rights for South Africans, and it's quite well explained and kind of, articled in the Constitution. So the next step, if the President does sign it in, will be PEN will be part of it, other organizations, to take it to the Constitutional Court to have it tested. Those of you who are not familiar with South Africa, the Constitutional Court acts as a kind of arbiter for legislation, either old or new legislation, that must match this very extensive Bill of Rights. So that will be the next. I think it's something to be greatly, greatly, greatly concerned about, because freedom of expression is, for me, the foundational right to all other rights. It allows people to protest about the education that they want, about bad health, about the government that might be doing things wrong. And it is an extremely, extremely repressive law that will put South Africa back. I think it will cut the wrist of our democracy unless we stitch it up. So it's a fairly lethal one, and I think it's one that South Africans are all kind of bracing themselves. I mean, we like a good fight, so it looks like we're going to get one again.
Okay, questions. I'm not quite sure how we are going to work the mic. Is there a roving mic, or are we going to use this one? Or maybe we can hear you if you project. Yes, sir.
We were in South Africa earlier this year. It was it was a wonderful time. And we spent as much time as we could discussing with everybody there the issues of this particular bill, freedom of expression, apartheid, and whatever. It did seem there was a lot of concern from both blacks and whites about the growth of a culture of sort of corruption among the ANC. The ANC is the dominant party, of which presumably this bill is an expression. And just overall concern that it was not necessarily that opposition that could clearly take control in South Africa and provide some balance, that it was sort of a balance. They were sort of a dominant party, and because of that, inevitably, human nature being what is, would lead to corruption. Your thoughts?
Well, corruption in any state is something that is regrettable. And in South Africa, there is corruption. And in particular, in the ANC, as the ruling party, there is corruption. And I think we must understand, in the context of the transition from ANC as a liberation movement to the ANC as the governing party. Excuse me. You know, as far back as 1989, as soon as it was clear that, you know, the ANC might be unbanned and we might have democratic elections, certain people actually positioned themselves, you know, to be part of the new governing party. ANC unbanned in 1990. Many exiles came back to the country, and then there had to be a campaign for elections. So where do you start from? You now here you're competing with a government, a party that is in government at the time, and has been at the helm for many years. So the ANC had to depend on donors, and some of donors are very corrupt individuals. On the one hand, the ANC might not have had good intelligence to trace the background of those people. But on the other, the reality is we needed money to reach out to the rest of the South Africa. You know, so such elements, you know, change the, excuse me, the outlook of the ANC, I believe. And thus, by the time we get into government, it is a mixture of people, some of them not very trustworthy. So we have some of those people in government. So corruption is imminent there. But at the same time, the fact is we have corruption. So what happens is there are institutions set into place, like SCOPA in Parliament, which investigates parliamentarians, government departments, everybody linked to the state. And I think it's a good thing that such a structure is headed by a very small party in Parliament. Actually, they have only one MP, I believe, that has nothing to lose, you know, and they really are doing their work, I believe. So beyond those structures, I don't think corruption really depends on the change of government. But the current government, when they realize that this is not a permanent seat, I think the more there'll be better governance. For instance, you know, next year will be elections, and the children who will be voting next year for the first time were born after apartheid. So they don't really have the baggage of the past. So now I think that kind of a generation would be able to judge the regime according to its current performance. Thank you.
Well, no. I just wanted to add on what he was saying, that indeed we have a lot of corruption, and lots and lots of it, both in the government sector and in the private sector and so on. But how we get to know of this corruption is because we have various structures, you know, that have been set, some of which are constitutional structures and so on, in order to expose that very corruption and to fight against it. We have a very robust press, without which, you know, we would never know about this corruption, you see. It is exposed every day in the papers precisely because we have a free and robust press. We also have those institutions which are statutory institutions, some of them, you know, which, whose function is precisely to root out that corruption and so on. So, you know, that's the good and the bad of it, and the bad and the good of it, you see. Yeah.
I also think it would be a mistake to see the government and the state or the ANC as entirely corrupt and everybody else is not. I mean, that's one of the ways in which it's often represented. I think that's, there is, as Zakes said, there's a massive amount of corruption. Equally, there are a great number of people who refuse to behave in that way, like Tuli Madonsela, who's our public protector. She's the sort of goddess of South Africa because she just goes around doggedly. She's a part of the human rights institutions which are set up by the state, digging up corruption, sending police commissioners to jail. I mean, she's probably the most loved and the most hated woman in South Africa at the same time. So the institutions and the structure of the society are the right ones. But that said, the corruption is absolutely corrosive. It kind of wears away at the texture and the fabric of the society. And what always worries me is that you'll get to a certain point of fatigue where people will just give up. Civil society will just say, that's how it is, just roll over, pay, you know, that kind of thing. So that's what needs to be safeguarded. And this secrecy bill, if it comes in, will make it almost impossible to expose corruption. It's kind of really, and it's a tipping point. It's that 18-year-old tipping point.
One cannot emphasize enough, you know, the role, you know, you're talking of civil society, the role of civil society in South Africa. Because, you see, what happened in many countries, not only in Africa, but in Latin America and so on, that newly acquired their freedom, was that the political leaders were deified, you know, by the population. These are people who fought for our freedom, and therefore they can do no wrong. And then when, of course, they began to accumulate things for themselves and to be rotten, people were silent. And they became gods, you see. And then, you see, everything was beyond redemption. But what has happened in our case is that we have very strong civil society, thanks, of course, also to the apartheid struggle, you see. We have civil society organizations, some of which, you know, are people who belong and vote for the ruling party, but who the next day will be out there in the streets demonstrating against the very ruling party that they vote for, whenever they think there's something wrong. That is happening, you see. So the strength of civil society, such as the organization, I mean, like Equal Education and so on, you know, which has taken the government from time to time to court for this or that. All those are civil society organizations, you know, that are there to safeguard, you know, our freedoms.
I think one of the most fascinating and impressive things about post-apartheid South Africa is even the constitutional commitment to linguistic diversity. You know, as you said, 11 official languages. I'm fascinated how that works, just day to day. Does that mean that all, say, governmental information is, governmental business is conducted in 11 languages, or how does information move through the linguistic groups? And then the second question is, you mentioned the inequalities in the dissemination of literature because of the dominance of English hegemony. Is that being affected by new media, by online publishing? Is there online access throughout all the linguistic communities, and is that affecting how writers are able to publish and distribute their work?
I'm going to get Sapua to answer that, but we speak 11 different languages among South African, and then I think the government speaks governmentium, which is what governments all over the world seem to speak, and none of us understand it.
Yeah, we have 11 official languages, and we have structures set up to promote the use of such languages. One of those structures, for instance, is the Pan South African Language Board. And the national broadcaster has got a radio station for each of the 11 official languages. So structures are there, and what that means also is that every citizen has got a right to receive correspondence in the language of their choice. And then in provinces, we have 9 provinces in South Africa with premiers and ministers at provincial level. Provinces, some of them have got policies to say, in this province, we have these 3 primary languages. In other words, in the case of Eastern Cape, they would have isiXhosa, Afrikaans, English, and Sesotho, because communities in that province speak those languages. So in Parliament, you have a right to get up and speak in any of the 4. But in reality, that is not happening. And that is even extended to the publishing industry, for instance, that about 49% of general readership books published are in English, 45 Afrikaans, and then the 9 English languages share the remaining 6%. So that illustrates how marginalized English languages are. And there are many forces that come to play when it comes to that, because we speak with these languages on a daily basis, but when it comes to official structures, they do not have a place. And part of the reason for that is what I alluded to earlier, that even the publishing houses are owned by people who do not speak these languages. You know, even the publishing houses that actually publish in these languages are owned by overseas. So you find a situation whereby publishing in indigenous languages is designed only for school syllabus. In other words, if as a practicing writer, you write a book in Zulu, you submit to a publisher, they take it and keep it until such time that the Department of Education advertises to say, can publishers submit material that we can prescribe for schools? And then they submit. If that book is not selected by the Education Department, then they don't go ahead for publishing. So as a result, India's languages suffer. That is just one example.
But I think you asked about new media. You can Google in pretty much any South African language that you want to. And I see more and more with Twitter and Facebook, that sort of media you'll get across a diversity of languages.
If there are other questions, if you want to come here to the mic, you can line up. Okay, there's just one here first.
The problem, audience like us, is a lot of us never been to South Africa, so we don't know what's going on after apartheid. So we try to understand with the structures we know from here or somewhere else. So my thinking is, I lived in Georgia. I used to have some friends in ANC when I was in New Delhi. My thinking is, what the African Americans tell me is, even though the apartheid is over, regime is over, still the white apartheid regime, who are not in power, control the economy, control the economic structure. So a lot of these Africans came along in the ranks in the ANC and others, the few elites, still under the patronage of those white regime, who are living there. So that's why some of the miners, shooting of the miners and others happened in recent past. So to bring it back home here, even though we have a black president in America, we still have a lot of discrimination and problems with black people here, even though we are minority or majority there. So does that kind of a situation still happen? To give just to frame it properly, in Atlanta, Georgia, the whites made a compromise with the black people. Blacks are in power, but the whites, they control in South. So if that's South African situation now is similar to that, and is that affecting the expressing voices or whatever?
Yeah. Well, South Africa, we talked about it earlier, that economically is hugely imbalanced. And one of the challenges is to transform a society. So what do you do to redress the imbalances of the past? And one of the instruments that are used by government, for instance, is the Black Economic Empowerment. Unfortunately, with all its noble intentions, the Black Economic Empowerment has not succeeded thus far, because any process can be abused. And it is the strategy that unfortunately has been affected a lot by corruption. So, you know, the economic imbalances, you find them in almost every aspect of our society. And that is one of the major challenges. I think, you know, recently the national government adopted the National Development Plan, which looks into development in South Africa from now up to 2030. It is a wonderful plan, but again, the implementation might be something else.
Perhaps the most helpful way for me to think about it, South Africa, is to think as a Marxist. And if you look at the shift as in South Africa as a racialized class system, you will find a much more nuanced way of understanding who owns the economy, who doesn't, how you've got a replication of a small white elite with now a white and a black elite, and very, like in Brazil, almost no structural change to the economy, which would allow a spread of income. So I know it's not the usual thing for Americans to think like Marxists, but it's much more helpful because it gets you out of thinking of the somatic qualities of race as some kind of explanation as to why people are rich or poor. If you start looking at the economics of it, apartheid makes more sense, and post-apartheid also makes more sense. And McCarthy's not around, I've heard.
A simple example, for instance, because when you talk about BE, it's very broad. South Africa started a housing project as far back as '96, if I'm not mistaken. And to build houses for people who are believed to be poor, have no jobs, or earn within a certain bracket of income. And thus far, millions of houses have been built. You know, I forget what the exact number, that houses that were built last year alone. But, you know, that kind of intervention needs to have a beginning and an ending. It was started in 1996, and at the time my nephew was in his teens, and today he qualifies to have a house. You know, so I believe to just build houses for people is not enough. You need to give people skills. People need to have jobs so that they can afford their own houses. And what has been happening also with that program is that you build a house for someone because we are trying to get rid of shacks. That same person would sell the house or rent it out and go back to stay in the shack. You know, and that has been the trend. So there's no solution really. I'm not sure if America has any program like that where you build houses for people for free. You know, we have to use a different model. But I think most importantly, we must give people skills to be able to generate income on their own.
The expectations of the rest of the world when it comes to what writers are putting out there and what's being published, such as apartheid and how it always comes up in the writing in one way or another. So today in 2013, what are some of the things that you would like the world to know about South Africa? What would you like to bring awareness about? And the second question is, do you feel that the publishing houses will support awareness of other types of writing that involve some of the other concerns that you have that are no longer apartheid?
So, well, I mean, publishers have been very supportive of South African writers, but our local ones definitely have. I think perhaps, those of you interested in finding more about how we're going to survive after the disappearance of Nelson Mandela, if you look at books that are being published, you can buy them online, download them, South African novels. What's fascinating is how people are writing into being how people live in South Africa. It's very interesting urban culture. Johannesburg, for instance, is Cape Town is exactly the same age as New York, which was founded and built by the same people. The architecture is similar. So there are all kinds of interesting things going on in those places which are completely absorbing. I mean, memoir writing, for instance, is very interesting, where you start to look at how Zakes' autobiography is a case in point, where you look at how people lived around and about this huge totalizing system. One thing I have noticed is, as publishing worldwide gets more and more globalized, more and more of our best writers are moving the settings of their books outside of South Africa. Lauren Bierkes, for one, she won the Arthur C. Clarke Science Fiction Award. Her new book, The Shining Girls, is set in Chicago. So, and I know of several other writers of my generation who are setting their books in the globalized elsewhere, and that's perhaps partly because people are less and less interested in politically and socially located fiction. They want something that kind of floats between airports, perhaps. But I think that's a function for writers everywhere.
We have time for one last question.
Okay, I have a question about the term an ethical narrative. And, it sort of goes back a little bit to the censorship issue, whether it's self-censorship or the government censorship. And I was thinking specifically of a book like The Life and Times of Michael Kay by J.M. Coetzee. So in that conversation of an ethical narrative, where would you fit a book like that, perhaps?
The Life and Times of Michael Kay is one of my favorite books. I mean, for me, I spoke about that very personally as a way in engaging in a country which there are many injuries, and you need to, freedom of expression, I think, as we've all found working in South Africa, is as much hearing people as it is saying what you want to. So I think it's in that balance.
Can you just give a chance, please? Because she has been,
Here's a mic.
I just wanted to make one remark. I lived in South Africa for 4 years. We had a meeting with publishers of the Association of Booksellers and Publishers that told me that from 45 million South Africans, I think you are?
We're 50 now.
Okay. There's only 700,000 that ever buy a book. So you are especially read abroad, but not in your own country.
Yeah, well, I think it's more complex than that. But yes, in South Africa, we have a huge challenge of the lack of a culture of reading. But when you talk about book buying, you must be clear what you're talking about. For instance, an academic text is targeted specifically in the academic sector. You can't expect everyone to buy a journal, and also there are books like, for instance, that do very well. You think of John van der Rohe's Part, which has sold over 200,000, But talking about general market, publishers are content with selling 5,000 copies. That is regarded for a general fiction novel that is regarded as a bestseller. Now, 5,000 to 5 million is 0.1%. And I am sure it is not a question of economy, because you have like people who can afford anything, have 2 cars in their garages, but do not buy books. So the culture is not there yet, and hence, in the past couple of years, in the past 6 years or so, there's been emergence of new festivals, book fairs, new writers getting published. And to me, that is a positive sign, because I believe with the emergence of every writer, new readers are born. So I would like to see in 3-5 years to do research and see what the statistics are. But on the other hand, a number of bookshops have closed down. And like we had the very first Exclusive Books, which is a big chain in a township in Soweto. And unfortunately, it didn't last more than 3 years. So that is an indictment that we're facing. But yeah, a lot still needs to be done. Yeah.
And bookshops are closing down here too, you see. So it's the same kind of problem. I might also advise you that when you make that research about these festivals and things like that, you should also make research on the grassroots movement that started a few years ago, where you find that in South Africa today, in communities, some remote communities, you know, people have come together to form book clubs. And this is initiated by them, you know, it's not something that is imposed on them above by PWS Department of Books and so on. It's a grassroots thing. I've been invited in some of the most remote places in Kwakwa, somewhere there, where it's mostly women actually not even mostly, it's always only women who have come together and are reading some book of mine, and they invite me to talk about it. Or they are reading a Sesotho book somewhere, or a Xhosa book somewhere in but mostly they will be reading Toni Morrison's Beloved. It's very popular with book clubs all over there. So there's that, you know, that's happening, and that is changing the culture of reading, you see, in South Africa today.
Thank you very much. Before I just hold your applause, before I thank our authors, will you, when we come down, will you let them go to the tables, which I think are there are books for sale, is that correct? So that, and they can talk to you there and sign books to your heart's content. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.